working with Bob, just the process of gathering data was a remarkable thing, just to get emotion and psychophysiology and heart rate from these couples talking to each other, thinking about the statistics of that. What an important reminder to us when we read about New York Times today, people faking data, right? Bob treated data as sacred, I think, in some sense, irreplaceable, that this is how we learn about human beings. And my friendship with Bob, for all these years in many different dimensions, I love Bob's, he really goes after existential truths, and I remember being a postdoc and not knowing where my career was going. And I think I cranked out a bunch of correlations and got, P0.08 correlations. I was like, what's it all mean? He's like, he really challenged me to think about, is this the life that I'm here to do? Bob himself had to choose between a career in music in his early days as a professor in science, and has chosen both. So we're very grateful to that. So I miss Bob. I think all of us do, but he's still around full force. And every time Bob gives a talk, I walk out of it thinking, I got to do new science. So it's great to have you give this talk, Bob. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to quit while I'm ahead. Please tip your wait person and drive safely. See you next career. So I'm not going to do a greatest hits talk. I actually put this together. It's been a while since I've talked to the department, and I thought I would, something was on my mind, and really leading up to the work that's been going on in my lab in the last couple of years with this really remarkable sort of final bolus of postdocs and graduate students, very talented, and taking us into some really new directions. So I will talk about some old stuff, but it is sort of going in the service of something kind of that new and that I've been thinking about, and so I hope you'll bear with me. All right. So the jumping off point for this, if you haven't seen it, this is the new Sphere in Las Vegas, where U2 did the first concert, and I saw it in the outside, but I missed the inside. But talk about an awe experience. I don't know if you've read Dacher, but everybody who's been there is just overwhelmed by this experience. And anyway, so in 1992, Ambati and Rosenthal came out with a paper where they really kind of talked about thin slices of behavior. And the idea was that there's a great deal of information communicated, even in fleeting glimpses, kind of focusing on expressive behavior. And then, 13 years later, Malcolm Gladwell, seeing a good thing, and to his credit, quoting all the scientists who did that work, including Ambati and a bunch of other people, wrote a book called Blink, where he really saw this theme. There can be as much value in the blink of an eye as in months of rational analysis. So there is a foundation of hundreds and hundreds of studies that have looked at thin slices of behavior. And the focus really, this is the slide that my wife told me not to show, but I thought Bob and I would like this. He always wanted to work at a deli. Most of the focus of that work is on, can you accurately make judgments based on these thin slices of behavior? And in the original Psych-Bowl paper, they looked at 44 studies, and they all looked at samples of behavior less than 300 seconds, and they compared these short observations with what they called, objective criteria. And most of it was stuff like, can you tell whether somebody's going to do well on a job by looking at a little bit of behavior? And then you looked at actually, how they did. Or, can you tell if somebody has an anxiety disorder based on a thin slice of behavior? And then you looked at their clinical diagnosis. So it was really all about rating accuracy, and the answer was pretty overwhelming. In every study they reviewed, accuracy was greater than chance, and the overall effect size. I looked at the original article, and I saw this thing says p less than 0.1. I thought, my God, that wasn't that good. But then I noticed it was the 112th power. So apparently that's apparently that's I think it's not impressive. But Robert Rosenthal was kind of a guru how to interpret statistics and popular understanding. And so it was kind of funny. That's the way he chose to show it. The accuracy was unrelated to the gender of judges. That actually, as a theme, was kind of interesting. Everybody believes that women are better at processing this kind of information than men. But in studies where you have objective criteria, those of accuracy, those sex differences tend to disappear largely. Now, a lot of studies, some had very thin slices of salami and some had thicker ones. The length of the observation made no difference. It didn't make any difference whether they were experimentally induced behaviors or naturalistic. And it didn't matter whether it was deception, job effectiveness, clinical symptom, whatever it was, the category was all about the same. And then they went and they looked at some thick slice studies, which were outside of the realm of the meta-analysis. Things where like you do 18 years of psychoanalysis and then you diagnose someone. And it didn't make any difference. The effect sizes were all the same. So they really walked away from this with this idea that, we have this capacity to make really judgments about really important things based on almost nothing. And that was, that was the foundation, I think, of what I'm going to talk about today. So today I'm going to take that idea and I'm going to move it in two different directions. One, I'm not going to only talk about behavior, but I'm going to talk about thin slices of biology, if you will, but really thin slices of physiology. These kind of momentary tremors in the blood, these little burps and gulps and eruptions that occur in the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And I'm not going to talk about accuracy a lot, although that's how we're going to start, but I'm really going to talk about do these slices, do these tiny little moments of behavior and biology, do they enable us to really make judgments about more substantive things like people's health, how well they connect to other people in the present and in the future? So are these like little signposts to where we are in these important parts of our life and where we're heading? So I'm going to start with marital interaction, which is the work that Dacher was talking about. And these are 3-minute slices. And the talk, in some ways, I was already thinking about it. And then something happened at the Ipswich colloquium last week that just really solidified it for me. So Claudia Haase is a former postdoc in my lab. She's now at Northwestern. She's an expert on health and relationships. She gave a lovely talk, really focusing on positive emotion. And one of the things she did is she showed this couple a little bit of their interaction. And she then asked people, is it a happy marriage? And, this is a very eminent, smart group. The Ipswich faculty from psychology and from business and from law. And, you pretty much are at the top, the A list. And so it turned out that everyone was wrong except for Gold. So, and afterwards I talked to her a little bit, and of course it's embarrassing the hell out of her. And then I had to ask her if it was okay to talk about it again today, and she's so gracious and said it would be. But, she just got it. And as I talked to her, it wasn't super rational the way she figured out that this was a happy marriage. Everybody thought they were unhappy, but it was almost like, gut feeling and intuition, and then filtered through, her intelligence and her training. And so, but I had the feeling, and we could ask her again, that it was just something she felt, and that every single other person in that room was overthinking it, and it was kind of leading themselves down the road and deciding, well, they just can't be that happy. But they are happy, and they were super happy. In fact, what I don't think Claudia knew is they were still happy 15 years later, because I went and looked them up. because it's a couple who went on longitudinal studies, and they are happy then, and they're happy, and so whatever everybody was seeing, you could say, well, when psychologists look at marriage, they know it's the future, no, only gold. So, all right, so I thought that I would start this talk today by giving all of us a second chance, except for Gold, who doesn't have to play. I don't know if you're here, but
she's online.
Yeah, online. Okay, Gold. I'm going to stop embarrassing you in 5 minutes. All right. So we're going to do we're going to do thin slices together. I'm going to show you 10 seconds of this couple, and then I'm going to let it run up for another minute and a half or so. And you have 2 questions. How satisfied are they with their marriage at the moment? Very satisfied, neutral, or very dissatisfied. And then 5 years from when this was shot, are they still going to be married? Okay. And I know there's some really excellent clinicians in here and some really savvy social psychologists. So we'll see how we do.
Oh.
10 seconds. And for those of you who may not know the paradigm, people come to our lab, they sit quietly for 5 minutes, a light comes on, and then they start talking about a problem that they've identified in their relationship. But that's a very thin slice of behavior. How many of you have an opinion? Okay, Dan, all right. How many of you think they're happy, very happy? How many of you think they're somewhere in the middle? How many of you think they're very unhappy? All right. How many of you think they'll be together in 5 years? How many of you think they'll be divorced in 5 years? Okay. All right. So that's based on the first 10 seconds. And, think about a couple of things. One, you had an opinion. I didn't have to pull it out of you, and you probably started processing this thing pretty quickly. And the second thing is that how many of you are pretty confident that you got it right? Based on almost nothing. All they did is a couple of bloops. You couldn't even really understand what they said. I think they said something like the problem or something like that. All right, let's let it run on. Watch the rest of this first 3 minutes. And then I'll ask you to do it again.
You gotta just let them do their bidding in life.
Yeah, I know. You know me. Just protective, and that's where I am. I'm starting to come out of it a little bit. It's like, what bugs me is when you say you move to a 1-bedroom place and I know you wouldn't really do that, but if I want to come, I come. If not, that bugs me. That's not funny. You say that to be mean or what?
Dramatic.
Wow.
You have to make them understand. You see, you get over too protective, and then it turns on you.
I know, yeah. I can't help it. Like Joey, when he was going to the beach the other day, I told him to be careful, remember? And he gets all upset with me.
Well, it's one thing
Too
to tell-
protective,
No, it's one thing
know.
to say something, but to be catering to them is another thing. To be protective is one. To cater is another. Do one or the other.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You can be protective in a statement and showing them that.
Well, that's like yesterday, Michelle, when she got all upset because I wouldn't take her to work. That's why I say I'm starting to come out of it. I didn't do it, and I didn't go pay her phone bill for her. And she called me at Chris's yesterday. I said, Mom, go pay my phone bill. I didn't do it. I said, no. Well, she didn't pay it.
But she contacted him.
Yeah, she did. She said she did him.
She took care of herself, right?
Yeah.
Exactly what I'm telling her. And she learns that she can't.
Yeah, I've made life
depend
too
on
easy
you.
for him.
There you go. That's what I'm telling her.
I know.
Well,
It might
you'll
take me a long time to get out of it.
hey, if you don't make it easy for them, then
I feel like I'm
they'll do
being.
it. No, you're not.
I'm not what? Wait a minute. Let me finish saying what I'm saying.
What?
I feel like I'm letting them down if I don't do for them. I don't want them to feel that, they can't depend on me.
They can depend on you on something serious. To go down and pay a bill that they don't want to go down and pay is not serious.
Yeah, I know.
That's their problem. That's where you got to stop the fine line of protecting and being abused as being.
And so now you've seen a little bit more. How many of you think they're very happy? You went up a little bit, right? How many of you think they're in the middle, average? How many of you think they're very unhappy? Okay. Oh, now you're not so confident. A lot of you didn't vote. Dan, what did you think?
I think they're really trying hard. What got me in the short clip was the spontaneous smile. I have a question. Are they looking at each other?
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, silly me. Yeah, they're dead on. They're like this distance, and they're being shot over their shoulders in split screen. When they look straight out at the camera, they're looking straight at each other. Yeah. Right. And then 5 years from then, how many of you think you're going to be married? How many of you think you're going to be divorced? Okay. And just in general, how many of you change your feelings after seeing the longer? Yeah, all right. Well, so Gold, what did you think? So here's the answer. They're both this is a very satisfied couple. This is almost 2 standard deviations above the mean for, American marriages in these age groups. They are still married 5 years later, and and 10 years later, they're both still married. And, some people look at this and they might say, well, he's not as happy as she is, or they're both about equally happy, and they're both continue to be equally happy at 5 and 10 years. So this is about as good as marriage gets, at least in our samples. Okay.
Gold was wrong on this one.
No. Oh, boy. All right, no more embarrassment for you. So this thing with Gold reminded me of this study that Rachel Eveling and I did a number of years ago, and we had 9 other videos, just like the one you saw. They were a couple. Problem. The subjects rated them on a 1 to 7 scale, and then this is kind of the same thing you guys did. And we looked at how well these ratings match with the couple's ratings, with their satisfaction, and we looked at their divorce status 5 years later. And the satisfaction level is just like you saw a very happy couple. We had very unhappy couples and those in the middle, and about 50% of the couples actually divorced. At that point in history, that was the base rate. About 50 to 60% of couples, married couples, were divorcing. We had 177 participants, and then what made this fun, for me at least, I had never done a study like this. Those participants were divided into different groups in alphabetical order. So there were people who had been together and were unhappy for 50 years. We had a bunch of them. We had people who had been together and were happy for 50 years. Political psychology graduate students, marital therapists in the community, some of the most famous and eminent, marriage researchers. We had a number of the big names in marital research, people who had just gotten married, pastoral counselors. It turns out there's a program in Berkeley for pastoral counselors, people who had just gotten divorced, and undergraduates, because you just have to have undergraduates. And to sort of keep with the Gold theme, here was the results in terms of the medals. The winners were the 50-year marriages, whether happy or unhappy. They were really good at this. The newlyweds were really good at it, and the recently divorced were really good at it. The silver went to the pastoral counselors and the marital therapists, so they had some training. The bronze went to the clinical graduate students and the undergraduates. And who's left? The absolute worst. You actually want to see what the data look like. These are the different groups, and I've kind of clustered them informally into those. But this was kind of interesting. The factor that sort of if you drop the groups and you look at what accounted for it, in general, age and duration of marriage were the things that made a difference. But the thing that was interesting is it really was the people, also the people who had just underwent a transition. You know, whether they just got married or they just got divorced. Maybe during that, maybe it's a state that you get into of sort of heightened awareness and sensitivity. Carol?
I just wondered whether the couples that are watching, do they all have kids or just some?
Oh, it's all over the map. Yeah, and you know, and we didn't break them down by whether they had kids. What's your prediction?
I'm not ready to predict, but
Oh, probably would, yeah. All right, we didn't look at that though. All right. Oh, and actually, you know, certainly in the 50-year marriage, I know all but one had children. Yeah, but I don't know about the others. All right. So, oh, there was one other medal that we were, and that was predicting divorce. And no one could predict, no group could predict divorce at greater than chance wise. It's about 50% in that sample. So people, you know, if you think about it, people could kind of get a sense, oh yeah, they're happy, they're unhappy. At least some people could, not people like me, but no one really knows, you know, how to take that information, package it up into the uniqueness of people's lives and really know whether they're going to be together 5 or 10 years. That's a really hard thing to do, and people can't do it. All right, so now I'm going to go from something really sort of social and complex to more at the heart of this talk, and that is I'm going to talk about some really brief biobehavioral moments. And now we're going to talk about something that's not in the realm of 3 minutes, but it's really in the realm of milliseconds to seconds. And that's the acoustic startle response. And this is a very well understood circuit in the brain. This is what it looks like in the rodent brain. It's really just, I think, 6 neurons. And it's works. You have these different sort of, there's a lot of research on ear puff, a lot of research on noise. The work we're going to talk about is with noise. And you end up in the same place in the colopontine reticular nucleus, and then that activates the spinal reflex, and you get this muscular behavior. And it's really quite similar in different species. So this is been well characterized. The early studies in psychology were by Landis and Hunt, and then Ekman, Friesen, and Simons did a study in 1985. What I really like about this study is this was a pistol. Not just a pistol on a tripod, and it was behind the subject's heads. So that's how they did it. And this is what they found, was that within 200 milliseconds after the gun was fired, 4 actions were present for virtually all of the subjects. Eye closure, neck muscle activity, head movement, trunk movement, and then sometimes tightening of the muscles around the eye and a horizontal lip stretch, which is kind of what you see when people are expressing fear. So it's kind of a hunching and a kind of a turtling up that sort of protects a lot of the soft areas. And that seems to be the reflex then, somewhat preserved as you move through different species. Now they just said as a throwaway that after that reflex, a little bit later, there's often something else that happens. And sometimes it's a smile and sometimes it's something else. So that's important. It also is a very well characterized physiological response. This is human data from our lab. It's about an average of about 90 subjects being startled with the acoustic startle. And so, you know, just what you'd expect, you see this, the startle noise there is about 30 seconds, and you see this sudden increase in heart rate, a burst of somatic activity as they move, the skin conductance, which is a little slow to respond, sweat gland activity kicks in. You see peripheral vasoconstriction, which is part of that sort of activation pattern. And then there tends to be a deep breath. That's that. Okay. So people, as they're turtling, they often go, and that shows up as well. And so this is very, very reliable. It's a lot of subjects average, but this is one of these things. It's not like EEG data, like, you know, like Bob or Mark would work with. We have to average lots of trials. You see this in a single trial in a single subject, and this is pretty much what it looks like. Now, we wanted to make this a little more interesting psychologically, so we have 3 versions of it. Oh, and I have to tell you that human subjects did not allow us to have a pistol. Most of my disappointment. But we did, so we made the noise come through speakers, or now we use headphones sometimes, but in the original work, we had these two giant rock and roll speakers, like 1,000-watt rock and roll amp. And it was literally taken from a rock and roll band, and it, could just create the sound that was very enveloping. And we had to hold it to a certain limit for safety, but that was what we did. Now, the kind of the basic one in green, I'm going to use these colors throughout this section of the talk. So green is go. This is, you don't know what's coming, and you just get startled. And that's really interesting because you can get a really nice measurement of the startle reflex, which I've been showing you, but also that secondary response. Now, the second one is the warned one. And Dacher, I believe you have one of the early papers on this, am I right? And there you have a countdown that's, going down. We have a 20-second countdown where it's going 10 for 2 seconds, 9, and then it goes off. So you know what's going on. Now, that turns out to be gold. Not gold on the talk. No more gold. That gold is different. It's golden. That really is a wonderful period, because if you know it's coming and you know it's not going to be nice, you start doing things. You start preparing, and that preparation turns out to be importantly diagnostic. You'll see in a second. And I think in your paper, Dacher, as I recall, you really documented the fact that when people know it's coming, the behavioral part of the response really starts to be diminished. You don't tell them to do anything, but when we know something awful is going to happen, we can do something. Now we probably call it emotion regulation, but then we didn't know what it was called. But that really enabled it to be less disruptive. And the other thing we did is we told people, okay, try just to completely eliminate the response. Just don't feel anything, don't show anything, don't let your body respond. Now, this is what this looks like. So this is not Dacher's work, but it's very similar findings. So green again is the unwarned, yellow caution is the warning, red is the suppressed, or stop if you're trying to remember what they are. And you see that the observable behavior goes down in each. So by the time you get to suppressed, you've actually started to eliminate a lot of this stuff that Ekman and Friesen and Simons described. Interestingly, and very importantly, if you look at the physiology, now this is just the cardiovascular response, it's just the opposite. So as that behavior goes down, the amount of work that you have to do to sort of control this is expressed. It creates a metabolic demand on the heart, and the heart has to work harder. So this is part of this phenomenon, I think, that you see in sort of psychodynamic theory all the time, that when you hold an emotion in, it comes like on the face, it'll come out in the body. I think that's a funny way of describing it, but I think what I would say from sort of a physiological point of view is it takes real physiological work to tamp down this reflex that comes to us and is preserved from in evolution to help protect us from danger. So just remember that observable behavior goes down, but the cardiovascular cost goes up. Now, the other thing that's just wonderful about the startle, and this is the warned startle, I'm sorry, this is the unwarned startle, so the green startle, is that even though that everybody has sort of that first response that's kind of the same, look what happens after that. So these are just 3 people. These were undergraduates at Cal, and we're just going to look at them really fast. And here we go. I should also say that they're watching a video of Paul Ekman doing something that he does better than anyone who's ever lived. I think you would agree. He has a completely neutral face. And what I loved about this study is I'd say 50% of people said, what was that China figure? In the corner, I didn't know. So watch him, but he can do that. He can do anything he wants with his face, including stop it from moving. All right, there we go again.
Oh, geez.
Cooling down.
God.
So, this is very interesting to see these kind of individual differences. And in keeping with the theme of this talk, I'm going to ask you some questions here, without much. Okay, but ask them yourself, who would be the most unflappable in a crisis?
Yeah.
Okay. Play along at home. How many of you think number one would be the most unflappable? Thank you, Frederick. Number two. Number three. Okay. Who would have the most successful romantic relationships? A little harder. Number one. Number two. Number three. And I'll skip the third one. But so the point of this is, I don't know the answer to this. Remarkable is that we can take that, see that, and do whatever computations we all did to come up with those predictions. So, you start and how much time did it take for you to do that? I assume it was almost like in a blink. Isn't it remarkable that we have that ability or that proclivity to take this little piece of behavior and to make these judgments and guesses about what people's lives are like? So that's there. It's in all of us. Whether we use it or not, or we misuse it, is another thing. But variation is interesting, and whether or not I think based on the body work and all the other stuff, I think you probably would find that these individual differences really are meaningful, and they tell you, the kinds of things we think. But to me, the most interesting thing is that we do those computations and we do them so quickly, and there's quite a bit of agreement. All right, so now we're going to show how that kind of little process there really is very, very vulnerable to different kinds of neurological disease. And we're going to also show how it actually has some diagnostic utility, just like we probably made guesses as to who is going to have a happier life based on that slice of behavior. We can actually come up with some pretty good indicators as to what part of the brain is not working, and really maybe, what kind of a disease the person is suffering from. So this first I need to tell you a little bit about frontotemporal dementia. It's a non-Alzheimer's dementia that we got really interested in when Bruce Miller came up from UCLA and started the memory and aging clinic at UCSF, and we started talking together and working together, and we're coming on our 21st year, I think, of collaboration. So frontotemporal dementia is everything that Alzheimer's isn't. It's they're both progressive. It's anterior rather than posterior. The neurodegeneration is in the frontal and temporal brain area. The behavioral changes are in the realm of emotion, empathy, judgment, planning, social behavior, insight. All of those are sort of diminished. And then language is complicated, as I've now learned from being educated by Nina. We're working together on this kind of work, and some people have problems with language production, some with language perception. There's problems with fluency and all sorts of subtleties, but this is another area of the brain that's affected. And unlike in Alzheimer's, memory and spatial abilities are relatively spared. So until people started becoming more aware of these non-Alzheimer's dementias, you would assume, oh, well, this person is fine. They aren't forgetting, they aren't getting lost. They're just getting a little bit cold and robotic. But that's probably what old people are like, right? Yeah, we all know that. This was very underdiagnosed, and now there's a lot more awareness of it. And so because of the involvement of these frontal areas and these sort of emotion generating areas in the brain, it would not be surprising to see that something like the startle reflex would be impacted by this disease. So I'm reminding you here that when we look at unwarned versus warned startle, there is this drop in behavioral activation and there is this increase in the cardiovascular activation. So I'll show you a couple of examples. This is a healthy control person in the warned startle. Okay, so she had a pretty small response. She knew it was coming. That's kind of consistent with what we see. And here's a person with frontotemporal dementia. And for those not used to seeing patients, you're going to see that she sort of is stimulus bound and she starts picking up the countdown, and then you'll see what happens.
2, 1, 0. Watch the X, please.
Okay.
So you almost get the idea that even though she knew it was coming, she didn't kind of do much to get ready for it. And that's what the results indicated. So this was the data I showed you earlier in terms of observable behavior for healthy controls. And I'm sorry, this is a different, this is actually data from age-matched controls. And this is the average for a group of 32 people with frontotemporal dementia. And what you see is that you don't see that real significant reduction in motor activity. They don't really work in a way for this anticipated aversive stimuli. And as a result, their motor behavior is really quite large. Now, this is one of these things that's very consistent with the clinical picture, because you see them constantly violating social norms and kind of being surprised by the reactions that people have to them. Interestingly, if you tell them to reduce the behavior, they can do that. Reminds me, the first time I heard Bruce Miller at a case conference, he said, FTD patients, if you provide their frontal lobe, they look just fine. And so it's that real distinction which gives us the insight. Like, they have the capacity to downregulate, but they don't do the kind of processing in the normal world let them know that this is the time to do it. Now, this is the only group of frontal patients who we've studied, and this is a study we did with Bob Knight's group. And Bob, you might want to characterize these. I'm going to be very, very crude about them. These were 5 patients, and this is something that Bob does in his work, where he takes the CT and the MRI scans and he kind of aggregates them. So the red areas are where the damage is, and then as average, the overlap is the reddest area. So you can see that sort of red area in the center. And Bob, how would you characterize this group of 5?
Well, I can't remember those, but they're probably all trauma patients with orbital bone damage, and they all have various amounts of not functioning well in the social environment.
And I kind of remember, and this might be wrong, a number of them had motorcycle accidents. Is that?
The guy ran his motorcycle into a pole. Had a crush injury at his frontal lobe. I don't remember which one.
Okay. And so these patients, Bob and others have studied them, quite brilliantly. And we know a lot about the behavioral changes that go with these lesions. So now we're going to look at the two of the types of startles in these patients. And again, this time we're focusing on the cardiovascular activation. So it tends to get larger and larger as you go from unwarned to warned to suppressed. And we just studied them in the unwarned and the warned. This is 5 age-matched controls, and you see just what we would expect, that in the warned condition, you get more cardiovascular activation as they sort of prepare to deal with what's going to happen after the countdown. But in the orbitofrontal patients, and it's just 5 people, they don't show any of that. I mean, they actually show a heart rate decrease. So it's like they don't really engage in that preparatory response. Now, the literature on orbitofrontal patients has been sort of dominated by ideas that they're prone to risky behaviors, whether it's in real life or on gambling tasks. And it's almost like they don't get that signal that something punishing is ahead. And so they don't engage in those sort of avoidant behaviors. So this is an example, I think, of how a very little piece of biobehavioral, physiology or behavior can really tell us something quite profound about, to understand more complicated behaviors that seem to be disrupted by the disease. So you've seen it now in 2 kinds of frontal lobe patients, ones who have degeneration in FTD and ones that have lesions in these 5 patients that Bob gave us. All right. Now I'm going to talk about another piece of this startle picture. And this was a remarkable experience that we had over a 3-year period. Matthew Ricard, who's the author of some wonderful books on happiness, and he's the Dalai Lama's French translator, was doing sort of tour of all the labs, at the emotion labs in the United States and the world. And he came to our lab 3 times, and this is through Paul Ekman's work with the Dalai Lama. And we had a chance to put this really holy guy, holy man, he's just so funny, and he's a great man. He's just like so much fun to be around. And he was a scientist by training, so he's very, very interested in all this. And you know, we kind of so this is Matthew Ricard, who started. And so one of the first questions we had was sort of a trait-like question, and that is 30 years of contemplative practice, you know, is that going to somehow rewire the nervous system? Would we see that the reflexive and physiological part of the startle was in some way changed by that? And what you saw there is you saw that very much the typical startle behavior. Did anybody jump? Your phone's on. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. This didn't jump through a loudspeaker. On the left, you see a group of 12 men who are about his age, highly educated, and that's their heart rate response to the startle. And then on the right is an average of 4 times startling Matthew. It's well within the normal range. So there's no indication that that kind of a life has gotten under the hood and sort of rewired his nervous system. But the other question that he was interested in, and so we did as part of this, is whether is a state question, not a trait question. And that is, do different contemplative states, do they sort of change the susceptibility of the nervous system to these kinds of stimuli? So Mathieu did 2 kinds of meditation. The first one was called open presence, where you have this very vast, vivid and lucid and fully resting, being in the moment. I'm not a meditation person, so you know, I'm not a good person to ask for questions, but when I talk to people about this, this is the heavy duty meditation that really, you know, I think makes people feel very differently about the world. And then a focused meditation where you just focus on a fixed point. So it's the vastness, the fixed point, and then sort of as a control for the cognitive load, we had him think about a particular incident from the past. And so we were able to, and we did each one of these 4 times, and we averaged them. And what you saw is that the open presence, this is now looking at the cardiovascular activation. In the open presence meditative state, he basically, his heart doesn't respond. This is not, you know, it's like it doesn't get through. And when Matthew talked to us about it, he said, I was in this open space, and somewhere in the corner of awareness, I realized that there was this sound, but it wasn't compelling enough to leave where I was to come and attend to it. And that's the wonderful thing about working with a guy who's 30 years in meditative practice and is trained as a scientist, that he's a wonderful reporter. And so the focused meditation also, you know, was sort of diminished. And then the distraction again showed that just when he was doing stuff that you and I do, his body responds the same way. But these states really are getting at these foundational reflexive behaviors and the attendant physiology. I thought it was quite remarkable. And again, silly little startle thing with a silly little measure of physiology, you know, gave us a way of understanding the profound power of these states, but also the limits, that he wasn't being turned into some sort of a denervated person. So that was quite interesting. Now, this is some very new work that is being done. We were done in my lab with Quan Hua Chen, who's a postdoc. He's now at the University of Nebraska Medical School. And we're looking at the preparatory cardiovascular response. Again, this theme of preparation, and I'll show you what this one is and how we get at it. It's not startle, it's a little different, but it's the same theme. We're looking at 3 seconds of heart rate data when you tell people that they're going to be watching an emotional film. So they haven't started to watch a film. They know it's going to be emotional. They don't know what the emotion is, how good or bad. But it's again kind of like the countdown to the startle, but you don't know it's going to be a startle. So it's again this realm of anticipation and preparation. So it's the W2 on that thing on the right. Now, there's something that's been studied extensively in psychophysiology. It's called the orienting response, and that's very different. That's when the film starts and you pay attention. The orienting response, the heart slows down. This preparatory response, it actually speeds up. So once again, it's very, very reliable. And so we have a sort of a baseline, and now we can look at 2 different kinds of dementia and see whether or not this preparatory response is impacted differentially depending on whether the front of your brain is affected in frontotemporal dementia, or these more posterior are affected, like in Alzheimer's disease. So let's see what this looks like. So the result is really clear that people with Alzheimer's, with all of the problems that they have, and it's a profound loss of memory and whatever, this preparation response is physiologically completely intact. When they know something's going to happen in their lives of some significance, they psychologically prepare for it and their bodies do the work. But for FTD, there's this huge kind of deficit in preparation. And you see it in the physiology. And this is just a summary of the data showing, with the error bars, you can see this is a very striking difference. And it's in one of these I find inspiring, because when you do this kind of work with these small biobehavioral probes, you find things that are diminished, and you find things that are preserved. And in this case, people with FTD, they really don't have that preparatory response, but they still have the orienting response. So, that's one of the reasons when you're working with these patients, if you ask them, like, well, what happened in the film? They can tell you. And they can tell you the next day. They just don't respond to it emotionally, but they're orienting to it and taking the information in. Alzheimer's, this kind of stuff is still preserved. And I think those of you who have experience with people with Alzheimer's, especially in the early stages, they're still emotionally there. They may not exactly remember who you are and what happened and whatnot, but they are human, and they are responsive, and they have feelings, and they can be hurt, and they can feel a sense of triumph and love. And I think it's part of that fact that the world is still something that they prepare for. And I think it's captured in this little brief way. Now, one of the things that we did is, typical psychology thing. Does this make any difference? Well, happens when there's a thing called the neuropsychiatric inventory, and clinicians or caregivers can rate the patients on it. And one of the things you see is that in FTD, there's a lot of disinhibition. They don't have a lot of emotion control. And part of it, I think, is so they don't prepare. If you try to explain that in terms of this cardiovascular difference, it's fully mediated. So it's not a really great mediational design because it's not longitudinal. But I think this is part of that process. When you don't prepare, you don't inhibit, you don't adjust, and people see you as being emotionally out of control. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about, what time do you stop?
4:50.
Oh, yeah, I'll be done with it. The last thing I'm going to talk about is some work that we've also been doing in the last year or so in the lab. It's another kind of moment. It's a little bit, I'm going to end on a more positive note. And this is called positivity resonance. And it comes out of some work that Barbara Fredrickson did. She was a postdoc. She overlap with you? Yeah. When did it all start? True. Yeah. Yeah, she was in the lab as a postdoc and at the beginning of the affective science training program. And can you imagine all these wonderful people just kind of walking through the halls of Tolman Hall and coming to seminars, and it's just, there's an amazing time. Yeah. Anyway, so she has this idea in a chapter she wrote in 2016 about positivity resonance. And these are moments, short moments of shared positive affect, sharing nonverbal synchrony, which is the sort of the gestures and the behaviors of, being together and looking at it in your eyes. And then they're associated with biological synchrony. And you can measure that. The way we do it is we look at two people's heart rates and we look at whether or not they're sort of correlated in time. And these are short moments, like the little bursts of synchrony that occur for just a few seconds when you really lock in. And Barb's idea about this state sort of goes back and forth. And in her theory, it's the building blocks for positive relationships. So those of you who remember when I showed you that film of the couple who just took 10 seconds? How many of you said, oh, someone said it was Dan, that they had that smile moment? But I think that would get coded. There's something powerful about it. They just were locked in that positive way with each other. And I think if we had measured their heart rate, they would have probably been covariant. It didn't last very long, but that's what we're looking for. Those moments, they're both diagnostic and they're predictive. So anyway, so this is work Jenna Wells sort of has taken the lead on, but a lot of other people, Casey Brown is part of it, and Quan Chen, who are all part of the current generation, the recent generation in my lab, worked on this. And Barb came here for a sabbatical at Ipser, and so, of course, all my students fell in love with her, and they all, didn't like me anymore, but that's just Barb. So what we did is operationalize, the we here is really them. This is fancy stats, so I'm kind of trying to keep up. But we came up with a way of operationalizing a latent construct of positivity resonance. And it consisted of 5 different measures. A coding system that Jenna developed called BIPR, which is, I'm going to show you in a second, and we'll actually show you an example. And then I think this was, came out of Ipser, the synchronous nonverbal affiliation fuse. I sort of think this was a former Ipser person who developed this, but this is the coding for that kind of behavioral synchrony. And then staff coding, which is John Gottman's thing, which looks at express positive affect, a rating dial task that we've been using for decades, where people rate their emotion continuously, second by second, and then a measure of their in phase, that is positively correlated physiological linkage. And so you build a measurement model, and you do a confirmatory factor analysis, and all these, this was theoretically postulated, and all the factors load significantly, but when you really look at it, what's really doing the work are the more behavioral ones. So, and BIPR, this one coding system, it has the highest loading, and so we've kind of drifted towards just using that. Although in this particular paper, we did it both ways. So this is what BIPR looks like. I'm going to show you a section that got coded with BIPR, so you'll see what it looks like. And every 30 seconds, you watch 30 seconds of tape, and then the coder says, did positivity resonate between the two partners? Did they show actions, words, or voice that conveyed mutual warmth, mutual concern, mutual affection, and or shared tempo? And this is kind of gets at the output of all of these other factors like the physiological linkage and all the other things. Or two. So let me show you a little bit.
Okay, we'll take it away.
But you'll look at a book and you will say, I don't want to get rid of it because I read it 30 years ago and there's something about it that I like.
And I was reading about
But you can't remember what you liked about it. You just won't get rid of it.
If it wasn't that, then I wouldn't want it.
You don't like to get rid of anything. You'd like to keep everything.
I'm keeping you.
Isn't it amazing? It was going the other direction.
Yeah.
You don't know. you don't want to keep anything, and then I'm keeping you, and all of you warmed up. So that's. I mean, we could have coded that with the highest reliability. So, and that's what we're looking for in this coding system. And I think it's a few more seconds, but.
You want to go to the next part? Al?
All right.
So then the next part.
I mean, those are the Bipper moments, and so what we did in this paper that just came out in JPSP last year is we asked a couple of questions. So I think it's probably true that marriages and other kinds of intimate relationships, maybe friendships, but certainly all sorts of intimate relationships, if you have those, that's a really good something. And I don't know whether you can make, I don't know, Julian, what do you think? So you're a recent marriage guy. Do you think you can make those moments happen? Or do you think they just sort of come out of the ether?
Out of ether, I would hope.
Okay, yeah. But anyway, that's, but this was really asking, if you have those moments, what are the impact for your future health and longevity? So the first question we asked was, we looked at health trajectories. This is a self-report measure of health over 13 years. And importantly, it was not related to health at time one in the study. So we later control for it. So if you know how these latent growth curve model, latent growth models work, you have an intercept and then you have a sort of a trajectory. So we're going to control out for the intercept. You're really just looking at the change that occurs regardless of where the starting point is. So what it did predict is less negative trajectories of health over the next 13 years. If you want to decode this, this is what we're looking at. So these are worse health is going up. And as you would expect, over 13 years, everybody's health gets worse. These are people who are in middle and late life. So they're grown-ups and health gets worse over time. And this group at the bottom, in both cases, are the 5 Bippers. So that worsening is not it's slowed. It's not as steep. So everybody gets sick, but you get less sick. So and so that was the first finding. And interestingly, it's quite robust. You can control for the time one health, as I said before, age, income, education, health-related behaviors like smoking and drinking, and the amount of positive affect that they show individually. So, we look at a Bipper moment, that's a shared moment of this affect bouncing back. But people have lots of moments of positive affect that are disconnected from their partner. You can take all that out of the equation, and this still holds that the more Bipper, less of that age-related change in health for sure. So that was the first thing. But again, it's just self-reported health. So we did something that was a little more objective. We actually looked at longevity, and it was 30 years after the original study. And this amazing group of they looked at obituaries in the nursepaper, the national death records, and they were able to about a half of the sample had died. I think it was 48% over the 30 years. So we had a reasonable base rate for this. And the finding was that if you had low Bipper, the hazard ratio associated with that is 0.24, which sort of means that you are 75% more likely to be alive if you were in a relationship that had lots of these positive moments, shared positive moments. And once again, that was after controlling for all of those covariates. So there is something special about having these moments. Now, whether or not they cause you to live longer, or whether going back in time 30 years, you're already on a trajectory for living a long life, and maybe that something about that enables you to have the capacity. It's kind of hard to think that it goes in that direction, but of course, even with 30 years of longitudinal data, we cannot know. So this was very interesting. I started as a skeptic of this positivity resonance. I grew up in a time when it was the negative emotions that were interesting, the anger and the fear and the sadness and the disgust. And I love contempt, I mean, my life is full of contempt, but this idea, there's something special about these positive emotions, and especially when they're shared in that powerful way. But they have a lot to say about our health and social relationships. So here's some closing thoughts. I think that thin slice science, which started out really with behavior and was focused on accuracy, despite the fact that Malcolm Gladwell popularized it, it's still a really interesting field. And I think that expanding it to include more biological measures and these more simple kind of almost like reflex level pieces of behavior is really interesting. And not just to focus on accuracy, which of course we now know that gold is not perfect. She does make mistakes, but some of you did pretty well in terms of looking at them and making good guesses. But beyond that, these thin slices can tell us a lot about social functioning and about health. The themes in this sort of brief biobehavioral moments, I think, as I sort of think about what we're studying, I think we're interested in three really important parts of the human experience. So they're not always the things we think of. The first is preparing. Preparation is such a powerful theme in the work with the neurological patients and really in the work with and that whole idea of that a lot of our I think in a modern parlance you would say the brain is this predictive machine and it's making predictions about what's going to come next. That means to me that we have lots of opportunities to prepare. And that is such an important part of what our brain is sort of built to do. And when it stops doing it, we really are in trouble. The second is connection. And I'm not talking about just liking, but that sort of magic that happens when you realize after a period of time that you share something and you're sort of traveling together in a meaningful way through time. Whether it's Dacher and me, 30 years of being, just smiling in the hall. Or Oz and me just learning this week that we're both on. These are these kinds of wonderful things that really build relationships. And then soothing is the thing that I haven't talked about in this talk. But I think it's another really important momentary thing. That idea of calming down, and of course we do that for ourselves and also for the people who we love and whatnot. And that ability is also something that is both precious and vulnerable, and something you can lose to disease. And whether it's a tremor in the blood or a glint in someone's eye or the calm after the storm, this is where these little moments are where a lot of our lives are transacted. And of course, really good places to study for psychologists. It makes me wonder also whether we shouldn't be learning more about how to do this. That this up here is something that Paul Ekman's developed. And most of the people in my lab, I think, I don't know if they still do it. Brianna, have you learned this yet?
Yes.
Okay, well, so you learn how to detect these little micro facial expressions. And it's kind of like learning how to do facts coding, where you learn how to see exactly what the anatomical basis is of any expression in the face. I learned it in 1981, and I think it changed my life. I mean, should we really learn how to do this? Should we learn how to get better at detecting these brief biobehavioral moments? There's no question that people can learn with this MET tool to be better at detecting microexpressions. Does it change your life to know, to see these things in other people, to foster them? That's less known. But it seems to me like we spend so much time in the way we train ourselves, and we train ourselves for research and for clinical work, really on these more long-term things like my anxiety about public speaking, which has been going on for 30 years, or my concern about this or that. But yet, maybe spending more time with these brief moments to become better at detecting them and recognizing and doing something with them. And then finally, you can't help wonder, and this, I'm sorry, you don't think it comes out of your car all the time and you ignore. Are these diagnostic? I mean, when you work with neurologists, and we have two eminent ones in the room, they're often looking for first symptoms. And they're sort of say, well, first indication that you saw that maybe Bob's personality was changing, or or Mark was having trouble with memory. And sometimes these things can be remarkably diagnostic. I remember sitting in a conference with a patient who had a prion disease, and several months earlier, the first symptom was that his foot started falling off the accelerator in the car. 3 months later, he was dead. It makes me wonder, are these things, that were these brief behavioral moments and the changes in them, are they really harbingers? Or, could they be the maintenance lights for our lives, where, there may be things to do, like, to fix our broken relationships, to stop us from going down the path of full-blown psychopathology. Someday there'll be treatments for things like Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia, and you'll have to get them early, because they won't knit together the neurons that have died. They'll just stop you in your place. And so the earlier you pick this up, and the more quickly you can treat, the more likely people are to have full and better lives. And so are they harbingers of things to come, both good and bad? And I don't know the answer to that, but my intuition is that they probably are. All right. So thank you very much for having my talk. And
We have about 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll have a reception right outside. So thank you so much, Bob, and questions.
Bill, you have not paid for the movie ticket.
Such a wonderful talk. It's very convincing what you're saying about thin slices having importance. My question is at the beginning. There are billions of thin slices. The question is, how do you think about choosing ones that you chose?
Yeah. Well, I think, I wish we were so smart as to have had a good basis for it. I think as a lot of these things come out, like, what can we do in the laboratory? What can we measure? What's reliable? Dacher had talked about this thing about phenomenon-driven research. So for me, I read about the startle reflex, and I expected everybody to be the. What I saw was that incredible difference, and it, like there was something important here. So, in a way, it's like the science. You see something that mystifies you, and that's after 30 years of doing this. I think that the feat tuning, preparation, connection, and I think now I could probably make some good guesses. But yeah, there are probably thin slices out there in other categories that really out of a tradition, like in psychology, looking at flexible behavior, looking at individual differences in kind of simple logical tradition of observing interaction and what. I think it was not planned, but now you can start to make some good guesses. Yeah. And for which the thin slices prove accurate are the ones that where they'll prove to be predictive. Don't know. Yeah.
Can I just expand on that question that Bill asked and that you just answered? Because you're saying choosing thin slices and studying in the lab, right? But how about like the perspective of the person who actually chooses the thin slices, like on a daily life, right? In terms of like when you decide that this is a particularly important one, and you might be missing the ones that are relevant and focusing on the ones that are not relevant. And
I think that's the clinician's dilemma in a way that you so perfectly articulated, because I might choose thin slices that are all about rejection, let's say, and I might see rejection everywhere, or I might see thin slices that indicate my failures. my shortcomings, the things where I disappoint my parents, my partners, my colleagues. And that is, in a way, I think most clinicians will tell you that that's kind of a big hunk of psychopathology, and it's related to anxiety and depression and the like, where you're attending to these thin slices and you're seeing danger everywhere, you're seeing rejection everywhere. So yeah, I mean, if you take this stuff seriously, you could think about, well, if I'm doing that, or if I'm treating someone who's doing that, or raising a child that's doing that, I should recognize that and see if there's some malleability there. We don't know, can we change somebody who sees rejection behind every corner into somebody who sees the world differently? It's kind of what happens in cognitive behavioral therapy. You sort of reformulate and reframe. But it's one thing to think your way differently, and it's another thing to feel, not be so attuned to those things. And so I think you've raised a really profound question. Like your work with birdsong, and I think many of us are out there listening for a particular song, and sometimes it's not the one that's adaptive for us. And how do we sort of switch the tune? And I think that would be profoundly difficult.
Actually, I have a follow-up question thinking about adaptation, and I guess I'm think kind of there's a spectrum of accuracy reading slices. Do you think the slices where we're most accurate in reading them and interpreting them and predicting them, do you think those are most kind of evolutionarily based? Things like fear and sightings of predators, or even behaviors to indicate that there might be some threat. Do you think where the thin slices were most kind of accurate at reading them and predicting behavior? I think the most.
Yeah, great question. I don't know, of course. So I'll just pontificate, pretend I have an idea about it. But I think that the lesson of this is not that evolution kind of protects us from these bad perceptions and misperceptions. I think evolution prepares us to look in certain places. So we're prepared by evolution. I think of the work, like Arne Oman's work with how we're much more prepared to look at snakes than roses. So there's something about evolution that drives us to look for danger. Now, what happens, I think, in human experience is that adaptive thing quickly becomes an exclusive and overused focus, and then it becomes maladaptive. So my guess would be probably, I don't know, but it would be just the opposite. It would be the things that are biologically prepared are the most dangerous.
Popular man.
Yeah. You want to argue with that, or just
Sorry, I don't know how to prevent anything.
I put it in a cup of water.
What they talk about sort of these originating relationships that are very strong predictors of breakup, divorce, and support. Things like stonewalling. I think there's this respect in there as well, or something. And yeah. And so so you're talking about sort of like positivity resonance, anything about sort of like upsetters, or perhaps the other side of the coin in terms of the predictors of longevity in the relationship. And so I'm wondering from your research, what are sort of what other sort of relational dynamics you have observed that also contribute to the longevity of a relationship, right? Is it only positivity resonance that exists, or is it something else? I'm just wondering your thoughts on it.
Lots of other things. There's a large literature on what makes for a good marriages, and there are complicated things like shared values, or emotions like respect. And these are things that I think develop over long periods of time, and they're very cognitive. They're cognitivized kinds of things. So those are clearly important. But the positivity resonance is really at a different level. It's building block, and I think it's slower in the process. You know, it's diagnostic, so I would guess that couples who at each other, maybe they share value, they have this long history of problems together, all of these are things, you know. I didn't know the challenges, one of the things. It takes decades to survive challenges, you know, but this is something that happens with more. And I think the question is, does this happen at the beginning? It's like part of it. Like, you know, you've met a new person who's kind of special for you. Kind of sounds like Las Vegas. Yeah, and you know, are you having any fun?
Right.
Are they there right from the beginning? I think they are. And I think they capture that, you know, they're much more primitive, they're the primitives of relationships. Whereas these other things that we've studied over the decades are more complicated and I thought we're really finding out things very, very good. And again, I was a skeptic, but now sort of feeling like there's something really special here in the moment. And that each one of them, this is when I heard this idea, is building this that will end up, you know, in 50 years, they love each other. And almost.
One last question.
Dr. Bob.
So back to your first case, which I thought was really interesting. When I looked at the.
By the way, did you get any of these right?
Yeah.
Go on.
And I want to ask why.
Okay.
The first one, you know, obviously they had to smile together, right? And that to me was important. I like to ask people and they tell me they just got engaged, you know, does he make you smile? Does he make you happy? Not a key thing.
Killer. Yeah.
But the second phase, when I think a lot of people switched and said, it looks aggressive and it looks kind of, it's not good. To me, the guy maybe looks like a tough guy, but in fact, what he was doing was being empathetic to her. You know, in trying to let her know that I know your kids are taking advantage of you. So that's a question: is the degree of the empathy between the people a key driving factor? At least that's what I got out of that interaction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think if you look across all of relationship research, including psychotherapy research and what makes therapy work, empathy keeps on coming up, you know, and that idea of being heard and seen and felt and you know, there's this funny finding that women want to be seen for who they are. They want you to be accurate, and men want to be seen maybe 2 or 3 JNDs above what they really are. But I don't know if you can have a positivity resonance moment without that sense of knowing them. But you know, we talk in emotion research about 2 kinds of empathy, at least. One is called cognitive empathy, and that's like I show you 3 minutes of marital interaction, and you sort of think it through, and you say, well, there were 3 smiles, and you know, he sort of listened to her, and you have a bunch of sort of rules and if-thens, very, very Bayesian, and it's cold, you know, it's a calculation. And then we have like emotional empathy, which is just in that moment that, you know, you just have that feeling like, oh my God. Like a lot of you actually had that feeling when you saw them have that positivity. I was watching you, that positivity restless. It's not something you think. It's like, you don't overthink it. So I think both of them are important, but they're not the same thing. We know that. And you know, one of the interesting things you see in neurological patients, sort of learn this from you, is that you see where the natural divisions are, you know, where the perforations are in behavior, like where things are separable. And those kinds of empathy, cognitive empathy, being able to figure out, and emotional empathy, that sort of spontaneous gut level thing, they really can get, you can see diseases where one is preserved and the other one's knocked out. It's a very different process, I think, in the brain. And then because of that, it's a very different process in terms of our lives. Now, the question would be, what would you rather be in a relationship where somebody gets you because they can think their way to, you know, knowing what Bob Knight is feeling, or somebody who just knows you and feels you in the moment and maybe can't even say why?
So since
that was a question.
From your data, you should be terrible at this because I think you were in the first group. What did you think of that couple?
I thought all the things that you said, I thought the sort of the facial morphometry of the couple, when they were just sitting there quietly, was he looks like he's pretty damn angry.
That's his baseline.
Yeah, this is baseline, and you have to take that out. And then the first 10 seconds, I mean, if I had to tell you one thing to predict whether a marriage is going to be happy and whether they're going to last, do they smile within the first 2 turns of speech after they sit quietly for 5 minutes? It is a big, big deal. So I knew that and saw that. And then the third thing was when we started listening to the 3 minutes, then I got confused because he's hearing her, but he's also a little dismissive. You know, she's kind of begging for acceptance. And, you know, I'm sort of overthinking it. I'm thinking, you know, forget the smile. You know, so I think the answer is you don't want to look at people in still photos. And you don't want to look at too long a piece of behavior. But if you can see those brief moments, I think that's what you should trust.
Okay, last one, the last one. I am so like. And whether you, still, so being accepted by the other person. Safe. Looking at you. But it.
It's no longer startling, by the way.
Startle habituates. So the question was about attachment theory and how things like safe attachment, secure attachment, and anxious attachment might be related to these things, and they're more like a gut thing. And I think it's really interesting. I think it's really an interesting thing about the history of attachment theory. That you know that, and Berkeley was part of this, that the original attachment theory was really about that sort of feeling of connection. And I thought it was a primitive. And, you know, people like Jaak Pansep, they wrote books about attachment circuits in the brain. But in the sort of the Berkeley version of attachment, it really became very cognitive. And it was like diagnosed in terms of the coherence of the narrative that you produced about your life. So I do think we walked away from what may have been the brief biobehavioral moment of attachment, which still strikes me as related to this idea that connection, soothing, preparation for life's vicissitudes is really where people reveal themselves and their futures. So, okay.
Place to end. So much food for thought. So much food outside. Thank you, Doc.